Hi everyone. I'm going to be talking about intros and conclusions today. This is an area that I think a lot of people don't do much instruction on, and that a lot of students aren't really sure how to approach. But what we want to do is we want to look at how to do introductions and conclusions in a way that works for most of the courses that you take at university. I can never guarantee that these are going to work for everybody, because you're always going to have that one prof who says, never use personal pronouns on my papers, never speak to me as though I'm the regular person on the street, don't ever use a question in your introduction, that sort of thing. You're always going to have those kind of profs, and when they tell you exactly what it is that they want from you, you just give it to them. It's good practice for what it'll be like to have bosses who, have unrealistic and draconian expectations. I compiled the ideas that I'm going to be talking about in this video from a few writing books. And the reason I went in this direction is because I know that there are, even among my own colleagues at MacEwan University, there is dissension about what we ought to do with introductions. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to do what I would consider the right approach for any of my students. If I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, if I don't have information about something that I need to write about, then I go and I research it. So I researched it using a few books, and the books I've used are the first and foremost the Canadian Writer's Reference, which at MacEwan we just refer to as the Hacker, after Diana Hacker, who is the first of the writers who's listed here. And this is a book that many of our students at MacEwan use in their first English course. So I thought that's a good one to go to. And then I went with Essay Do's and Don'ts, which drives me nuts. The do's and don'ts thing, that's an apostrophe nightmare. There's just a rabbit hole waiting to happen in terms of how ought I to write that? What are the do's and don'ts of writing do's and don'ts? And it's called A Practical Guide to Essay Writing. I'm using Writing About Movies, which is a textbook that I plan to use in upcoming courses, of course, on film. And then Writing and Revising, a portable guide. And this is done by X.J. Kennedy, and Kennedy has been involved in editing a number of anthologies for English courses, and so he's written a lot about how to write for English courses in those anthologies. So I thought his Writing and Revising, a portable guide, might be a good source to use. And then finally, A Method for Writing Essays About Literature by Paul Hedrick. 5 different textbooks. And then I've also looked at MIT's list of introductory strategies on their website, and you can go and check that out as well. In fact, what I always recommend is go and Google introductory strategies and see what those strategies recommend. What I wanted to talk about is just some other things related to this strategizing that might be useful for you as you're writing intros and conclusions for your papers. Now, one of the first things that I often tell students is don't start with your introduction, and that draws looks of consternation and what? I'm not saying don't put your introduction at the beginning of your essay. I'm saying don't necessarily make it the first thing that you write, because until you know what your argument is, how can you know how you want to get into it? And Essay Do's and Don'ts says if you get stuck on what to say in the introduction, draft the body of your essay first. Okay, so that's one of the first tips that I give students is don't get stuck trying to write that amazing introduction, because introductions should be really good. As Canadian Writer's Reference says, whether you are writing for a scholarly audience, a professional audience, or a general audience, you cannot assume your reader's interest in the topic. You can't. It doesn't matter what the audience is. You probably need to be interesting. The sentences leading to your thesis should hook readers by sparking their curiosity, drawing them into the world of your essay, and giving them a reason to continue reading. And when you've got heavy-duty orders like that, that can be paralyzing as a writer. If your introduction has to be that fabulous, so you just sit there and you craft in the introduction and you're wasting time because you still got an entire essay left to write. So get in, write that essay, and then you'll know potentially, once you've written it, what you might want to say to get into it. And an introductory strategies are about having a plan for getting into our writing. And on the subject of being interesting, Writing and Revising, X.J. Kennedy and company, your opening paragraph should intrigue readers, engaging their minds and hearts, exciting their curiosity, drawing them away from their preoccupations into the world you create in your writing. And a lot of essay writers probably going, we don't create worlds. And I'm like, sure you do. You create worlds through tone, and you create a world of argumentation. These are academic textbooks about writing. And I think there's a certain level of arrogance that we have to come up against that and say, nope, introductions shouldn't be interesting. They should just be the facts. Standing on the shoulders of giants here. We tell our students all the time, come up with several sources that back up what you say. And what I want my colleagues maybe to do is to come to me and show me the sources that tell us to be dry, that tell us to be flat, to tell us to be boring. There are writing guides that recommend that you do some of the sort of dry approaches that we sometimes associate with an academic introduction. In the following essay, I will endeavor to explain, argue, whatever it might be. But as a critical thinking individual, I come back at that and I go, that's just dry as toast. And if your prof wants you to be dry, go ahead, give him toast. Me, I want some jam on my toast. I want something on my toast that's going to make me want to eat it. So give me something that's going to interest me in your writing. Now, how do we do that? We go with some introductory strategies. That's what we do. So here are some introductory strategies. Offer a surprising statistic or unusual fact. 2 of my sources supported that one. This entire list was originally from a Canadian writer's reference, but I can't recommend Kennedy's list enough because it's phrased as a question, but we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So Kennedy said it, and so does Canadian writers' reference. And one of my favorite books about writing, They Say, I Say, says that we ought to ground our argument in what others say before we move on to what we're going to say. We're entering a conversation with others. Having a surprising statistic or unusual fact is one of those they say moments. Ask a question. This one is incredibly contentious. I have lots of colleagues who say, never begin an essay with a question. But Kennedy says you can. Hacker says you can. An essay do's and don'ts says ask a rhetorical question. Doesn't necessarily say something like, phrase your thesis as a question. But 3 out of my 5 sources say ask a question. So I got 3 sources that back that up. What's interesting to me about a question is that it doesn't give me an answer right out the gates. Now, someone who's a critical thinker is going to go, well, I can just flip that on its head. Now I know the thesis. But not all readers are critical thinkers. And I want to train people to write in a way that's interesting and compelling for all sorts of readers, not just academic ones. Introduce a quotation, and then the hacker includes or a bit of dialogue. I don't know about the dialogue, but a quotation, that's common as a strategy. So again, this one says it, this one says it, this one says it, and this one says it. Just make sure, that's 4 out of my 5. 4 out of my 5 say that you should use a quotation as an introductory strategy. But just make sure that you're not grabbing your quotations from like quotation.com and it's just topically relevant. Make it thesis relevant. Most research papers that you're going to write in university, you're going to be using sources. Use a quotation from one of those. If you're writing for an English course and you're writing about a particular story, use a quotation from that. Use a quotation that's relevant. It's a great way to get in. Just make sure that you're doing what They Say, I Say recommends with quotations and that you're framing those quotations adequately. Never assume a quotation is self-evident. Provide historical background. Now again, this one says do it. This one says do it. And this one says do it. And again, it's a they say move, right? Provide historical background. What might you need to know to understand the rest of my argument? Now, don't just include historical background that's topically relevant again. Make sure that it's going to get your reader into your argument. Remember, an introductory strategy is about welcoming your reader into your argument. If your strategy doesn't do that, it's a bad strategy. Define a term or a concept. Says it, says it, says it. So define a term or concept. Define key terms. Don't define words that don't need definition. Like if your essay is about arborists, you don't need to define tree at the beginning. But let's say your essay is about the word apocalypse, and you want to challenge the meaning of that word. You want to stretch it a little bit. Then, yeah, include the normal definition and then say, I'd like to challenge this. Maybe even include some indication of where you're going to be taking your shift. Or if there's a term that hasn't been really well defined. I taught a course on magical realism. I did my PhD on steampunk. Both of those terms, not really well defined. So you have an opportunity as a writer to make your argument out of that very key term. Propose a problem, contradiction, or dilemma. And there was only 2 that recommend this, but I can't really say that that's entirely true, as the next set of strategies tend to be a little all over the place. Canadian Writers Reference says that you should propose a problem, contradiction, or dilemma. And Do's and Don'ts, essay Do's and Don'ts says, use a provocative or controversial point. Those seem to be similar ideas to me. So find a place in the argument that everybody's arguing about. And so you can come in at that point and you propose that problem, that contradiction, or that dilemma. And you can bring that out of your reading. That can emerge from your research. So it doesn't have to be something that you come up with out of the blue. Use a vivid example or image. So if you've got an image that relates to the text that you're working with, so for example, I had a student who compared Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains, the experience of reading that story, with being in an escape room. That's a cool image that helps me understand where the rest of the essay is going to go in discussing story through setting. And then the one that I have used myself quite a few times when I was doing my undergraduate, but I've also used it on a number of articles, is the anecdotal strategy. Relating an anecdote. Tell a story. Trouble with telling a story is we love to talk about ourselves. That's an easy way to write a research essay. I don't do much research if I'm just writing about what I think. But again, it has to be a strategy that takes you into your argument. So let's go back to that apocalyptic example that I gave earlier. You might, because I'm recording this video during the social distancing period, during the coronavirus pandemic, I'm guessing we've got some anecdotal introductory approaches that we could take to writing an essay on the apocalypse or post-apocalypse. And as I said earlier, I love Kennedy's approach to listing off introductory strategies. Most texts that list introductory strategies just state them like, anecdotal, an analogy, a quotation, a question. What Kennedy does is ask questions, and so the reader can ask themselves those questions in ways that might provoke an idea about the right introductory strategy to use. So Kennedy says, what general situation would help narrow down your point? Help narrow down, right? So we realize, hey, maybe my introduction needs to narrow down my focus. What points should you preview to prepare a reader for what will come? My introduction can prepare a reader for the rest of my essay? It sure can. What points should you preview? So a lot of students will always include all their points. Do you always need to include your points? Is it necessarily the best strategy for you to use? Writing is an evaluative process, so evaluate whether or not this particular strategy is going to prepare a reader for what will come. What assertion or claim might be the necessary prelude for your essay? The necessary prelude. Asking that question, is this the right strategy to get into my argument? We've always got to ask these things, okay? Let's change gears and let's talk about conclusions. Essay Do's and Don'ts warns against that tried and true approach where you get to the conclusion and you go, this is what I said in point 1, this is what I said in point 2, this is what I said in point 3, and all you do is reiterate your points. This is what Essay Do's and Don'ts has to say about that. Don't summarize too much in a short paper. It becomes repetitive. Although a summary is useful in a long paper, what do we mean by long? I'd say anything over 10 pages, where the reader needs to be reminded of the main arguments. In a short paper, a summary can become boring or almost insulting to a reader. And that's especially important to remember when you're done at university, writing for your boss, writing for your work, writing for your colleagues. Restating the thesis is enough. You just say, hey, this was my point. You don't have to devote the whole conclusion paragraph or section to summarizing the essay. So what do we do? If we're not going to do that, what do we do? Well, coming back to the idea of introductory strategies, many of my textbooks say something along the lines of you should tie your conclusion to whatever your introductory strategy was in some way. Essay Do's and Don'ts talks about correspondence between the introduction and the conclusion. The Canadian Writers Reference has an example that says here is a conclusion that includes a detail from the introduction, and also says in a section on conclusions, to make the conclusion memorable and to give a sense of completion, you might bring your readers full circle by returning to the thesis or including a detail from the introduction. This Writing About Movies book says the thing that I like the best. It says, just as the introduction sought to place the paper in the larger ongoing conversation about the topic, and if you know They Say, I Say, it's all about putting it in the conversation, right? About the topic, so should the conclusion insist on returning readers to that ongoing conversation with the feeling that they've learned something more. So your concluding strategy should be an echo in some way of your introductory strategy. That's really what's being said there. You want to connect it. You want to connect it to that introductory strategy. And one of the most basic ways that you can do this is if you use a question in your introduction, then you give an answer in your conclusion. If you give an anecdote, you don't tell the whole story, you save some of it in a relevant way. It can't just be like, oh, I saved some for you, but it doesn't have anything to do with this. It always has to tie in, right? It has to be relevant to what you're doing, and that's you strategizing. If you have a quotation in your introduction, maybe save some of the observations that particular source makes. Maybe it makes a similar conclusion to what you've said, or maybe it's another moment of responding to a naysayer. It's something that we didn't talk about as a potential strategy for introductions, is acknowledging what your opponents say. That's something that Writing About Movies recommends. It's something that They Say, I Say recommends. And just as a final note, some don'ts from Essay Do's and Don'ts. Don't add new information. You're wrapping it up and not trying to start another topic. Don't throw in leftover ideas or thoughts that should have been in the body paragraphs. Nobody likes deleted scenes. We usually watch deleted scenes and you go, well, there was a good reason to take that out. Same thing goes for the content in most of our essays. And do not apologize for not having covered the whole topic. An essay is not meant to be an exhaustive treatment of an issue. It should be focused. And so should your introduction and your conclusion. So here are some approaches that might help you as you're writing essays throughout your semester, be it at high school or post-secondary. Now, you might be going like, well, are you going to tell me about what these strategies are? Heck no, I'm not going to tell you what these strategies are, because you can find all of this stuff online just by Googling introductory strategies, and then you can read about the approaches that they talk about there. I'm simply saying that these strategies are worth your time. They are worth looking into because they're going to make your introduction interesting, and they're going to guide your reader in a way that isn't just sort of the, let me start my essay without any preamble whatsoever, and then it feels like the intellectual equivalent of being kicked into the deep end of the pool, and then the instructor yells, "Can you swim?" Right? And we want to guide our reader into our ideas. We don't. A lot of the texts that I've talked about today recommend that we not start our argument in our introduction. You're introducing your argument. You want to start developing the argument? That's for the body paragraphs.